I'm Sam Tolley, I'm the current president of the Alumni Association, and so I'm very pleased to welcome so many of you back to college. I was having a chat with David, who tells me it's about 80% alumni, but some of you have brought your friends and family along as well, which is great. If you didn't have contact with college directly and someone told you about this because they received an email, it would be worth contacting one of the development team who's here to make sure that we can contact you in future if you'd like that, because there are a lot of exciting things going on both from the development office and also the Alumni Association. So as a group, the Alumni Association has organised some really spectacular events in the past. I'm sure this one will be in the same vein, and in fact it does reflect something of an event that we did in 2020, I think. It was pretty much the last thing that I went to before COVID locked us down, as I recall, on women code breakers. And that was a really fantastic event, but there's so much more that can be said about women in that era and also current times, and sort of reflecting how that was the beginning of a sort of intelligence gathering service, which has obviously expanded tremendously. I'm going to introduce the speakers. First of all, we will have Veronica Lowe, who is the former president of the Alumni Association. Many of you may know her. She has a distinguished legal career, and she is also very, very good on detail, so she's put a lot of effort into this. She's good at that. We work as a good team. I'm less on the detail. And Claire Hubbard-Hall, who actually, I think you met Veronica at the other place. I think that there was a talk in a place that can't be named where they met. They might tell you about that. But obviously there's a book at the back of this as well. So Claire has written a book called Her Secret Service, The Forgotten Women of British Intelligence. And she is an honorary associate professor of intelligence history. And in 2023, Claire decided to uncover new stories about women in the history of espionage who are rarely named and often forgotten. So amongst other things, they managed an emporium of secret paperwork so relevant to operations at Bletchley Park. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about that later. Just to say as well that we had an event last year for this alumni lunch that involved a spy as well, undercover spy, and we are hoping perhaps in the alumni weekend to sort of to bring that back as a future event. So there's very much a theme running through our events at the moment. And I'd also just to welcome the men, because it is Women's History Month, and we are talking about women of St Hugh's and other places, but we recognise that there are other people with an interest and a career in that field too, and we wouldn't want to seem partial, but we just want to celebrate the history that we have. So, without further ado, I think I'm going to hand over to Veronica Lowe. You're going to come and stand here, yes? And you have a mic already. I'm going to turn mine off, and yes, really looking forward to it. Thank you.
Hello everyone, it's absolutely wonderful to be here and to see all of you, see a wonderful packed house. Sam has mentioned that we did hold the symposium in 2020 on from Station X to Generation Z, and that was on women codebreakers. We were also featuring then 21st century careers in cyber security and code breaking, which our current graduates careers which they could follow. We featured then 36 of the St Hugh's alumni who we knew had served at Bletchley Park. Now, the number has actually gone up to 39, which actually shows the ongoing research, the importance of it. And I include within that the women who actually served in the Y listening stations abroad in places like Colombo and Alexandria. I particularly mention that for two reasons. One is we already knew about Nancy Sandars, who was a very eminent archaeologist, And she was a Wren petty officer engaged on special duties. She manned listening posts in Cornwall, Devon, and actually for the D-Day landings, which was an amazingly intense experience. But the point about the listening stations is that you can join the Bletchley Park Roll of Honour even if you never set foot in Bletchley Park, because you were part of the intelligence network which fed the raw material to the code breakers at Bletchley Park. And second reason is that the 39th person who we could consider as one of our veterans, she was the renowned poet Ruth Bidgood. She served with Wrens as a coder in the Y station in Alexandria. That's from 1943 to 1945. She was born in 1922. Her maiden name was Ruth Jones, and she matriculated in English in 1940. Now, I'm still working on that. I need to be in contact with her relatives and descendants for more information, but I would regard her as our 39th woman, and there are still many more leads to follow up. The 37th and 38th were actually Nancy Littlewood, who matriculated in history also in 1940, and Joyce Lloyds, who matriculated in classics in 1943. So that brings the number to 39. I would emphasise at this stage that I've had fantastic support from our archivist, Matthew Chipping, and also from Dean Annison, who is the archivist at Bletchley Park. I would also welcome, say a few words of welcome to Dr. Janetta Corley over there, who did invaluable earlier research on the lives of women at Bletchley Park, but also their service during World War II, which is much wider than Bletchley Park. An important motivation behind the 2020 symposium was to show to relatives that these women were not forgotten. Now, unfortunately, our very last veteran died just before the symposium. That was Octavia Fawcett, always known as Bridget, who died in the January before we held the symposium in March, and it was just before her 100th birthday. She actually worked as a Foreign Office civilian in Block A Naval Section. At the 2020 symposium, actually standing here, the widower of one of our very last veterans, Dorothy Davey, who died in autumn 2019, he actually fainted when I read out his wife's name. It shows the immense importance of these reminiscences. That, I should have said, is Nancy Sandoz, an amazing picture of a very serious-looking woman, but she's the first person I actually mentioned. She started out as a dispatch rider, and then, as I said, she was a Wren petty officer on special duties. Now, this is Dorothy Davey. Fortunately, we didn't show her photo at that time. I apologise that it's rather grainy, but it was her widower who fell ill at the symposium. And she was in the ATS and served in the what's called SIXTA, which is Signals Intelligence Traffic Analysis. We're very fortunate in having at the archives a lot of material and some photos. But really, we need more information. We need photographs, we need scraps of information from people who may have that at home in relatives' diaries or letters, anything that might have been kept as mementos. One of the objectives really is to show that these were real women. They're like our mothers and grandmothers and great aunts. They were real women with real pursuits, real interests, and they weren't simply ciphers for the very important work at Station X. And I would say that because no doubt quite a few of you will have seen Keira Knightley in The Imitation Game, and earlier than that, Kate Winslet in Enigma. We're talking about real women here with real stories. It's also very important to think of them as, if you like, a cohort. They're a unique cohort. We have, as a college, we've contributed so many distinguished women to so many walks of life. But this is a cohort of women who can be studied, who read different subjects, but were actually in the single pursuit of national security in one place at one time. Also, if we bear in mind that in the wider world, and I'm sure this is where Claire's fantastic research comes in, we know of the names of Turing, Knox, Hinsley, Flowers, Welshman. They're all men. And there were 7,500 women serving at Bletchley Park. How on earth this was kept hidden, I've got no idea, but it was. And of course, it wasn't just the business of cryptanalysis. What we're looking at is the empire of paper that Claire refers to. What we've actually got is a huge amount of activity which supports code breaking. So, for example, I've mentioned the Y listening stations. I've mentioned Sixter, which was the traffic analysis. We've got technical translation and emendation, interpreting and distributing strategic intelligence, operating the Typex machines, Colossus, the bombs, tracking Luftwaffe activity, interpreting weather reports, plotting ship movements, and also painstaking logging and indexing. And the historian Asa Briggs, who was in Hut 6, actually said, we all depended on easy access to meticulous indexing, an essential component in all code breaking. It's estimated that every week 2 million punch cards, an early form of data processing, were in use every week at Bletchley Park. And Harry Hinsley, who was the official historian of the Secret Intelligence Service, British intelligence during the Second World War, he said that as early as 1942, Bletchley Park personnel were reading 4,000 high-grade German signals each day, with only slightly smaller numbers of Italian and Japanese signals. Whatever we know about the eccentric geniuses and so on, they're supported by the work of all the people, mainly women, who were doing those tasks. So, about 35 miles separates North Oxford and Bletchley Park. But for the young women of St Hugh's, what is an hour's drive in a pre-war Austin 7, if you had one, took you to another universe. Yes, there were fellow intellectuals, picnics on the lawn, boarding school food, musicals, dances, often including professional pre-war performers who were actually at Bletchley Park too. And of course, when the American officers arrived, quite a lot of sociable fun. I'll come on to that a bit later. But the only person I can think of who would have regarded Bletchley Park as familiar was our own Wenda Reynolds, who matriculated in English in 1934. This is a wonderful photo of Wenda. She's top left, but it actually shows what college was like before the idea of war work, loomed on the horizon. And this is Wenda as a young woman and being greeted by Prince William for her 100th birthday. She was very familiar with Bletchley Park because she was the daughter of the local doctor who treated Lady Leon, who had been the previous owner of the mansion. And she actually worked there from 1940 to 1945 in recruitment and personnel. Now, somebody once said to me, oh, well, Wenda wasn't a code breaker. But the answer is she never actually claimed that she was. She knew everybody there by virtue of her job, and also her friendship with Barbara Abernethy, who was Commander Denniston's personal assistant. They were great friends. And Wenda got a job by actually asking Commander Denniston, who was the operational head of the government Code and Cipher School, she asked him for a job. So she got a job. And she was there for 5 years. She did some absolutely sparkling reminiscences for the Bletchley Park Oral History Project, which definitely worth reading. And she had a very impish sense of humour. There was a very august person there, Frank Birch, who was head of the naval section. And she said of him, oh, Frankie Birch was great fun. He was a Cambridge professor who'd played Widow Twankey in the West End and was a bit of a gossip. I mention this because it's true. He had a very distinguished naval service in World War I. He left Cambridge, where he'd been lecturing in history, to become a comic actor. And he starred in 18 films in the 1930s. That shows how Bletchley Park attracted the most diverse of characters. Wenda died at the age of 104, and a number of us had the great privilege to know her. But who were these young St Hugh's women? There were 14 modern linguists, including Italian and Spanish, as well as French and German. 7 historians, 8 who read PPE, 4 classicists, 3 mathematicians, 4 who read English, and 1 archaeologist. They comprised 24 Foreign Office civilians, including 3 ranked as linguists. Therefore, they were recruited as graduate translators. Of the 24, 2 appeared to have a Special Intelligence Service classification as well. There were 3 Air Ministry civilians, one of whom also appeared to have an SIS classification. The uniformed service personnel were represented by 8 in the ATS Intelligence Corps, including 2 subalterns and 2 sergeants, and 4 Wrens, including a chief Wren and a petty officer on special duties. That was Nancy, who we saw earlier. All of them, actually, even the modern linguists, had higher school certificate French. Quite a few of them were musical, which, of course, helps with pattern recognition, and there's sometimes a correlation with mathematical ability. The dates of birth of these women, who made the leap into the unknown, ranged from 1913 to 1925, with the preponderance being in 1920 and 1921. So they were generally in their early 20s when they reported for duty at Bletchley Park. The earliest matriculation date for St Hugh's women was 1932, and that was Alice Bishop, born in 1913 and was a modern linguist. And she was in Naval Section 1G in Hut 7. At the age of 30, when she arrived, she was the oldest of the cohort. What were they like? According to the obituary of Zadie Garrett, written by her son, they came from rather a sheltered background. Now, although this sounds rather odd to put it like this, but there is information on their fathers' careers which might give an indication of their background at that time. 13 were professional men, 8 were businessmen, 6 clergymen, 5 in the armed forces, 3 teachers and 2 civil servants. 2 of them also appeared to be landowners. 23 of the women attended independent schools. For example, Octavia Fawcett, who I first mentioned, was the head girl at Benenden. 5, including Zadie, went to grammar schools. 9 attended county high schools, which pre-war could be either fee-paying or free, depending on the local LEA. It's also worth noting that, again, something that Claire has come across, that some of the recruits were recruited because they were women of good family who were known to existing members of the intelligence services, and so deemed to be discreet and reliable. And our example, for example, is Anne McDougall, who matriculated in PPE in 1939. She married Richard Crossman, a cabinet minister in Harold Wilson's 1964 government. But her 2008 obituary records that the Tam Dalyell, who wrote the obit, Asa Briggs told him that it was the custom of Bletchley Park to recruit intelligent young ladies from respectable families who could be trusted. Anne McDougall was both local and ideal, and she became the landowner of her family estate in her own right. Photos are rare, as I've said. Group photos are rarer still. This is not a professional photo, so therefore the people there in the college gardens, probably just across there, were probably there by alphabetical order or year, whatever. And we think, it's not annotated, I'm afraid, but there would have been five of the veterans at Bletchley Park there. There would have been Alice Bishop, Wender, who I've mentioned, Margaret Jackson, who read modern languages. She was a specialist in Spanish and worked in the Berkeley Street Bureau. There will be 3 women there who actually matriculated in 1935. 2 were modern linguists, Mary Darwall and Alison Fairley. Mary was an emender of German decrypts and tracked Luftwaffe bombing squadrons. And she was one of the 22% of our women at Bletchley Park who met and married a co-worker there. 22%. Wow. Dr. Alison Fairley had a very distinguished post-war academic career as Professor of French at Cambridge. And she, because of her interest in medieval weaponry, worked on obscure technical jargon on weaponry, and she was very happy doing that at Bletchley Park. There is a marvellous obituary, many very interesting things about Alison, but her 1993 obituary described her university teaching as exhilarating and alarming. The final matriculant in the photo, the 1935 photo, was Margaret Rose, and she exemplifies something that you will know. In her obituary in 1997, a friend and contemporary of hers here at St Hugh said, "During the war, Margaret served for some time at Bletchley Park, but I never discovered what exactly she did there, which is not surprising, as the work was secret. That encapsulates many, many things." From each of the next 3 matriculation years, 1936, 1937, 1938, one person went to work at Bletchley Park. And they tended to be, the first 2 were modern linguists who went as Air Ministry civilians. 2 of them probably had a SIS classification. I've got a lot more info because we want to hear Claire. I will skip a lot of the names here, but if anybody wants to know, I've got all the info. The 19 women who matriculated between 1932 and 1939 were able to finish their degree courses. The 7 women who matriculated in 1940 should have been able to complete a 3-year degree, but records here show the start of disrupted studies for some. But even in 1942, there was some evidence of normality. That is Daphne Clark's graduation photo wearing the original fur that we were, even in my year, allowed to wear fur on our hoods. It's rather interesting in that the recruitment evidence in the St Hugh's files starts in about April 1942. But we've got a situation in which Daphne was told that she should be reporting for duty at Bletchley Park, but didn't want to go. She wanted to go to the fuel ministry. And she'd been told by a Mr. Birch, no longer acting as Widow Twankey or a Cambridge historian, that she had no choice. More normality. Diana Colbeck, who's right in the middle of the middle row. Another modern linguist. And she matriculated in 1940, and she was able to complete her degree before becoming a Foreign Office civilian in the Naval Section 4. As we know, in December 1941, conscription was introduced for all single women between the ages of 20 and 30, with a choice of joining the armed forces or working in vital industries. Constance Senior was actually called up right in the middle of her degree. She'd matriculated in maths in 1940 and told the principal in 1942 that she could not return to college because she'd been called up. There's a euphemistic letter saying she volunteered, but I don't think that's the case. She didn't get back into college until 1946, which is not an atypical situation. Also, possibly not atypical, is that she met and married her husband, John Castles, who was also working in the naval section at Bletchley Park, and he became Professor of Pure Maths at Cambridge. Much recruitment evidence relates to the redoubtable Principal Miss Guire, and she was behind the scenes recommending people, writing references, and so on. Often they turned out to be quite formulaic because she had to write quite a few, but she was very diligent at it. And there's a very moving letter to her in July 1942 from Pamela Gibbons, who actually said, "I have decided not to return to college, not to take up my place, because I feel that I should be doing what male undergraduates are doing, and that is, if I go and do war work, it will fit me for the problems that we're going to face after the war. And also, as male undergraduates are giving up their chance of an academic life and career, I feel that in a spirit of equality, I should be doing the same." It's 1942. And I think I've got, oh, no, I'll go back. We'll wait for June. Mary Blake actually wrote to Miss Guire and said, "Thank you for recommending me. I have an interview with the War Office, and I think I'm to join something called the ATS Intelligence Corps. It sounds very, very interesting. We have to start in the ranks, so that will be a great experience. And I'm learning Italian because I think that might help." And so it's a wonderful example of willingness, but not really sure what it is you're about to do. Hence the leap at the, you know. But the ATS. Now, I've shown you June Rigby. What a wonderfully serious photo. 8 of our women joined the ATS section, and she read PPE and decided to join the armed forces rather than take a civilian posting. She wrote, and again for the Bletchley Park Oral History project, a very detailed account of her role in the log room of Block G as a traffic analyst. What she was actually doing is studying, if you like, the foibles, the personal characteristics of the people transmitting the messages. And she gives a particularly graphic description of what she was hearing during the Battle of the Bulge. Another lovely photo. In her 80s, Marion actually said she had very bright memories of working at Bletchley Park. And I thought that was a very beautiful photo. But as I say, we're quite short on photos. Quite a bit more I could say about those, but I will just press on to show you some rare photos. I mentioned Nancy Littlewood right at the start. She's one of the people we discovered at Bletchley Park. And with all credit to Bletchley Park Archives, these are 2 of our ladies, Nancy Littlewood and Heather Harris. Nancy was History 1940. She worked at GCHQ until 1960. Heather was Classics 1939, and both were Foreign Office civilians in Block D6. Block D6 seems to have been rather sociable. I'll just show you Stella Castor. who also met her husband at Bletchley Park. He's a name that some of you might know, Nigel Forward. He was plucked out of the sixth form at Marlborough College, Gordon Welshman's old school, because of his mathematical ability. And it's variously described as a leaving party or VE day, and they're the second and third on the right of the front row. It wasn't all, as you can see, it wasn't all doom and gloom, although the working conditions were hard. Now again, we owe a lot to Bletchley Park and their willingness to share photos with us. This is just to show there was a bit of fooling around. Innocent fooling around, of course. So this is actually at a wedding reception, believe it or not. And that's Marjorie Watts, who seems to have been very popular. And clearly, Reg Brown, the officer Reg Brown, is proposing to her, and he has a rival in the US Army lieutenant who somehow has procured a croquet mallet. There he is trying to propose again. And that is the reappearance of the croquet mallet. And the photographs were taken by Lieutenant James Nielsen, who's on the top row, holding the mallet. And he left to Bletchley Park a fantastic album of photographs. So these have quite a few of our women, quite a few other people in as well. But they show that you could actually have fun. And with the US Army officers there, I think you probably could. 1947, a world away. There are two veterans there. Formal photo, Gilman and Soane, and it also shows Betty Kemp, who, strangely enough, actually taught me. So, but it's a world away now. The last group photo is 1935. This is 1947. There are no others. And we're totally reliant on what we can glean from people. OK, finally, before we come on to Claire, what did they do after the war? 14 stopped work on marriage. 14 became teachers or lecturers, 4 senior secretaries or administrators, 2 senior social workers, 2 in government cultural roles, 1 archaeologist, 1 landowner, 2 or possibly 3 served at GCHQ. Thank you very much.
Just to say thank you very much, Veronica, for that. It really brings these people to life. You know, they're the most incredible women, and it just shows the fact you're here, that it's still of tremendous interest and kind of informs the way that we move forward in intelligence. So I'm now going to hand over to Claire, who's going to give us another perspective on women in intelligence. So please welcome Claire.
Okay, right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can everyone hear me okay? Yep, brilliant. I've got a thumbs up from the back, so that's good. Okay, right. Well, March is my favourite month of the year because it's Women's History Month, where I get to shout from the rooftops about all these fantastic women that never sought recognition, and we can try and put that record straight and make history her story as well. So I think I shall be doing that for the rest of my life, is trying to rewrite these remarkable women who worked in the shadows back into history. And I'm sure, I'd like to think that they most definitely would never have spoken to me, I'm sure, while they were alive. But I'd like to think that they would have gone away with a little smile, thinking, at least part of my story, what they can find out, can be told. So I'm going to kind of zoom out a little bit now and offer a different perspective to complement Veronica's fantastic talk and focus in on a particular group of people at Bletchley Park whose story hasn't really been told in any great detail. And like most history, it's the men that get the limelight first, and the women obviously, you know, come up in second place. So I'm trying to switch that and turn it upside down. So I'm going to be focusing on the women of MI6 who were at Bletchley Park. So the women who worked for Britain's Foreign Secret Intelligence Service. Okay, so let's get started. Right. From cleaner to codebreaker, women performed a wide range of roles at Bletchley Park, from the extraordinary to the more mundane and routine, but all were critical to achieving Allied victory, because something that always gets forgotten, intelligence work is teamwork. It is never the result of a lone agent or one singular spy master. There's a huge team of people working together. Now, for the thousands of women, civilian and in uniform, who worked at the centre of Allied code-breaking during the Second World War, some of their stories have been told and continue to be shared. However, there are still many, many stories, as we've heard today, that are waiting to be written into the history books, including those women who worked for MI6, who I recently celebrated in my first book, which is, you can see a picture over there, Her Secret Service, The Forgotten Women of British Intelligence. And within chapter 8, I shine a light for the first time on the several hundred MI6 women and men who worked separately from the code breakers, the staff of Government Code and Cipher School, which obviously then comes on later to become GCHQ. And these men and women of MI6, they initially occupied the first floor of the mansion. Now, how many of you have been to Bletchley Park? Fantastic. That's a fantastic raise of hands. Those that haven't, I do encourage you to go and visit. Well, unfortunately, when you do go and visit the mansion, you're only permitted to walk around the ground floor. You're not allowed up onto the first floor. Now, referred to as the other side by the code breakers, the staff of Government Code and Cipher School, the MI6 women were a mix of young wartime recruits and older MI6 careerists, professional women in their 40s who had attended places like Pitman training colleges and Mrs. Hoster's Secretarial College. And those that had devoted their careers really did live their lives very secretly, serving their country. These women worked under the camouflage of being a secretary, a clerk, a typist. But what can be seen as a very misleadingly low-status job title, in fact, was the perfect camouflage, because it masked the many different roles that women were performing, and generally less paid than their male colleagues. Women at Bletchley Park for MI6, for the main part, their job was making codes, encrypting and encoding, and breaking codes, decrypting and decoding orders. So they were the ones that were communicating directly with MI6 agents out in the field and MI6 intelligence officers who were working under consular cover in neutral countries during the war. But there was also a whole host of other women who were at Bletchley Park, who I tell their stories for the first time, which kind of goes to the antithesis of quiet paperwork and code breaking. At the very start of the Second World War, in September 1939 till about November that year, Section D of MI6 was actually located at Bletchley Park. Now, Section D went on to become Special Operations Executive. So they were the people known as the Big Bang people, the people that devised incendiary devices, bombs, etc. So out behind the mansion, there are workshops and stables. So very temporarily, you had these kind of scientists, chemists, and also women who were working on devising particular bombs for sabotage purposes behind enemy lines, and incendiary devices, which were used with the ornamental lake to put the fires out in front of the mansion. You can probably imagine why they didn't stay there very long, only a couple of months, because the code breakers weren't happy at suddenly their work being interrupted by bombs going off. So that just gives you a flavour, and again, those stories are told in the book. Now, while several of the young recruits later committed their wartime recollections to paper or tape recorder, the MI6 careerists are undoubtedly the hardest to research of the Britain's secret services, which I cover in the book. Because even after they retired, they never really severed links with their former secret employers. Now, Kathleen Pettigrew was an MI6 super secretary who served as personal assistant to 3 MI6 chiefs. Late in life, she declared to a family relative, "I was Miss Moneypenny, but with more power." And that still gives me chills every time I say it out loud. Now, Kathleen spent her retirement in Sidmouth in Devon, and for 30 years until her death in 1990, she managed to leave little to no trace. No bowls were played, no bingo, no social groups. I mean, it was incredible. Now, compared to researching the women of Britain's other secret services, trying to get at women like Kathleen Pettigrew, who worked for MI6 for long careers, has really been like trying to unravel an enigma wrapped in a mystery. For those that know Winston Churchill, you'll know I've taken his quote and amended it there. Now, part of the challenge is that MI6 has never released any of its records, and sadly that doesn't look like it's going to change anytime soon. MI6 careerists like Kathleen spent a lifetime shying away from having their photograph taken. They burnt private papers in the months leading up to their deaths, taking many of their secrets to the grave. So in many ways, men are actually far easier to research, given that they're the ones that are making the decisions as recorded in the files that we can look at the National Archives. Whereas on the other hand, women are the ones that are creating, that are organising, and that are archiving these organisational documents. So evidence of their use and handling of paperwork survives in the forms of chits and cover notes. Their typed initials feature in copies of typed correspondence and reports. All are remnants of a bureaucratic culture that no longer exists in the digital era of the modern office. For the main part, I found that women's records, and Veronica has mentioned this, typically lie outside the archives in private family collections, making them incredibly time-consuming to research. This women's history in the Secret Service is not a quick history. And in many ways, when I was researching the book, which roughly took, I would say, about 8 years to do, and I was doing this while I was still in my academic career, in many ways, I had to take on the role of becoming a counterintelligence officer, piecing together scattered fragments, leaving no stone unturned. So anything I could get my hands on, like Veronica said, any scrap of information that might be a chink of light. Any detail, however small, could be the key that unlocked a door of discovery into Bletchley Park's secretive past, allowing me to step through the looking glass. You can see all the John le Carré coming through this, isn't it? And it did. Now, what often gets forgotten is that Bletchley Park was essentially, to begin with, an MI6 operation. They don't like to tell you that on the Bletchley Park tour, but that's essentially, it was an MI6 operation to begin with, until Britain's Foreign Intelligence Service handed over complete control of the park to the codebreakers, Government Code and Cipher School, in 1942. Now, MI6 staff had been present at Bletchley from 1938, when Hugh Sinclair, the then head of MI6, he was the second head, activated the war station, believing that war was going to be imminent. Obviously, Neville Chamberlain came back and waved the piece of paper, and it was averted. What we can see in this photograph here is what has become known as Captain Ridley's shooting party. This was, I think, much later in the 70s where this name became attached to this photograph, an incredibly rare photograph, which is featuring the MI6 officers and codebreakers arriving in 1938. Unfortunately, you can try and zoom in on their faces, but you can't make it out, unfortunately. But I've no idea why it became known as Captain Ridley's shooting party. Apart from Captain Ridley was the MI6 officer in charge of administrative duties, and he was the one that oversaw the move and set up but there's no guns in this photograph, and there's also nothing to shoot there either, and they don't look like they're going on a shooting party either. But anyway, that's the name that stuck, and there's now a pub that's taken that name in Bletchley. So MI6 and the Codebreakers, Government Code and Cipher School, are this kind of really weird dual organisation that is in place at Bletchley Park to start with. But MI6 is the umbrella organisation. It has this overall administrative control of the Codebreakers. And from September 1939, Kathleen Pettigrew, the real Miss Moneypenny, and the other MI6 staff had temporarily relocated to Station X, known as Bletchley Park, from 54 Broadway, MI6 headquarters in London. And she joined the move because on the first floor of the mansion, she set up MI6 communications, known as Section 8, which dealt with all kinds of MI6 communications, including the communication with agents and officers abroad. So she helped establish what became known as the Codists, located in what had once been the Lyons family's servants' rooms, sort of on the right-hand side in the middle of the mansion on the first floor. But of course, it remains a mystery to most visitors because we're not allowed up. However, as the woman who inspired Ian Fleming's Miss Moneypenny character, Kathleen was never chained to her desk or filing cabinet, and there was certainly no trilby thrown on the hat stand for her to collect, as we see in the films and the books. Kathleen belonged to this group of core professional women who, through hard work and merit, had advanced in MI6 and achieved economic independence. Now, unlike the university students interviewed for a position at Bletchley Park by the famous Miss Maud Moore of the Foreign Office, who was the spotter being sent round to keep an eye on all of the women at the various universities around the country. Some of the women's backgrounds were far more humble than others, and this included Kathleen Pettigrew, who never attended finishing school or had the opportunity to go to university. And I was quite amazed because it's the opposite of what we have this image conjured up of Miss Moneypenny, of being a former debutante wearing the beautiful pearls. I think ultimately of Lois Maxwell. They were the Bond films that I grew up on, the iconic Miss Moneypenny. So Kathleen was born in Bermondsey in London in 1898. Her maternal grandfather was a Bermondsey lad who was convicted of theft when he was 17. He served 6 months in prison, as well as receiving several strokes of the whip. Now, for the main part of her childhood, Kathleen grew up above the parents' shop in George Court, which is off the Strand, which you can still, if you go and see any of the plays at the various theatres on the Strand, you can go and have a look down George Court. At the time, it was a bustling passage located off the Strand, and we've got here a view from both ends of the alleyway across 2 decades. And the family were confined to just 3 rooms, with other residents in that building restricted to just single rooms. And the family ran a chandler's shop below. Now, her parents worked incredibly hard and managed to earn enough money to send Kathleen and her older sister to the nearby St Martin in the Fields School for Girls, a charitable enterprise aimed at providing Anglican teaching for female children of the poor at a reduced rate. Now, after this, Kathleen attended secretarial training, which helped her secure a position in Special Branch during the First World War, where her older sister was also working in the registry. And little did anyone know then that she would rise to become one of the MI6 chief's trusted inner circle during the Second World War, and as I argue in the book, perhaps one of the most powerful women in Whitehall. Her career spanned until the end of the 1950s, when she was awarded the OBE on her retirement. During the war, around 8,000 letters sent by the MI6 chief Stuart Mingus crossed her desk, as well as, and this is the important thing, thousands of decoded Enigma messages that had been received from Bletchley Park's Hut 3. When Enigma, or Ultra as it was later designated, left Bletchley Park, its first port of call in the sequence of leaving Bletchley Park was MI6. MI6's job then was to determine how that intelligence would best serve whoever out in the field of operations. So they would decide if it would go to an admiral, whether it would go to SOE. They were the kind of the gatekeeper of this key information. And the person who was the linchpin for all of that entire process was Kathleen Pettigrew. She really did serve as a loyal gatekeeper to a clandestine empire that relied on secrecy and invisibility. So she was instrumental in setting up the codists in the mansion on the first floor, where she oversaw a group of very talented women, some of them from university, some of them not, who dealt with numerous cipher messages received from MI6 agents, etc. Now, MI6 had installed Radio Station X in the mansion's tower in the early 1939, and they'd attached an aerial to a large tree on the green in front of the mansion, which you can see here in this photograph. Now, by the middle of 1939, the wireless station had moved to one of the first huts that had appeared on site, to Hut 1, which was located just in front to the side of the mansion. And then MI6 communications team, along with the radio station, would make one final move to the nearby Wadden Hall at the end of February 1940, where they would remain for the rest of the Second World War. Now, MI6 didn't have control of the codebreakers throughout the entirety of the war. They actually handed control back to the codebreakers. You can imagine, to Commander Deniston's relief. Too many cooks spoil the pot, I think, on one site comes to mind. MI6 handed control back to the codebreakers in 1942. But the majority of MI6 staff who were still present at Bletchley Park, they departed and returned back to London HQ. However, nearly 100 MI6 women, consisting of codists, typists, teleprinter operators, tea makers and messengers and couriers, remained at Bletchley until the end of the war. And they moved from the mansion to Hut 10, which was quite, again, still close to the mansion, but it initially housed the air intelligence section. Now, the work of the women carried out there remained completely separate from the wider work of Bletchley, the code breaking that was going on. The women operated on a 3-shift rota. The female codist sat at one of 2 very long tables within Hut 10, hunched over endless pages of messages that had been sent from brave agents operating far away behind enemy lines. But one of the key differences, unlike the women working in the other huts, the code-breaking huts, who had no idea about how their small individual tasks fitted into the bigger picture of the war, the MI6 women of Hut 10 were completely aware of their contribution to the war. Now, Ruth Sebag Montefiore was one such woman. The wartime recruit had worked at Bletchley as an MI6 codist since 1941. Her cousin's family, the Leons, had once owned Bletchley Park. And in her candid memoir, which was published in 1987, Ruth declared, "One never knew from day to day what the in and out tray would reveal." She described how agents would send messages providing details of safe houses that could be used by new agents and escaping prisoners of war. And she worked from either a paperback novel or an exact copy filled with 5-figure groups and numbers to encode and decode agent communications. And the agent, again, would have the same 2 identical books. Urgent telegrams would sometimes arrive alerting MI6 to the sudden disappearance of an agent, warning London that there was a leak in the chain. Messages such as this were marked with 3 Zs to indicate the degree of urgency. Incoming messages from agents provided a huge amount of intelligence from enemy troop movements, sightings of U-boats, as well as providing times and safe locations for agent and supply drops. And a few of the women codists working in Hut 10 suffered from nightmares after the war because they constantly were plagued with dreams about all the agents who had fallen into Gestapo hands and never made it home. Now, with regards to who was recruited as codists, MI6 liked to keep its circles small, exploiting personal relationships and social connections. The head of Hut 10, Leslie Rowley Hill, a retired general and a brilliant linguist, approached his personal acquaintances with a view to recruiting their daughters and nieces. Of course, the key requisite was a good working knowledge of several languages, including French, German, Dutch, and Norwegian. Many debutantes were recruited on this basis, including the glamorous Lady Cynthia Tothill, well known as the face of Pond's beauty products. The haughty-taughty Hut 10 deputy was also a regular feature in the celebrity gossip columns for her male friends. But there was an extension of trust in her appointment to Hut 10 because someone in MI6 knew her people. Now, I want to give you a contrasting story. A handful of career women from foreign backgrounds also worked in MI6 and found themselves at Bletchley Park. But with no one to vouch for them, those such as Lucy Lunn had to prove themselves long before they arrived at Bletchley Park in 1939. And the four Lunn sisters, as they became known, are a unique case in the history of British intelligence. And I tell their story, their extraordinary story, in full in my book for the first time. Now, born in Russia to an English expatriate family, Edith, Lucy, Helen, and Peggy fled their home outside Moscow with their parents and brothers in 1917. The family travelled to Britain and settled in London, rebuilding their lives after losing everything to the Bolsheviks. The family had once owned one of the largest cotton spinning mills in Russia, managing a 1,000-strong workforce complete with workers' housing, a hospital and a school. Now, upon the family's arrival in Britain in 1917, the eldest sister, Edith, worked in postal censorship during the war. Afterwards, in 1919, she was briefly employed as an MI6 secretary at the British consulate in Helsinki, but her employment was terminated after just 1 month because she had been turned red. The Russian Revolution had caused an ideological fault line between the siblings, with Edith, the eldest, becoming a committed communist, separated from the rest of her kin. During the 1920s, Edith went on to work as a secretary at what was known as the All-Russian Cooperative Society, ARCOS, located in what was known at the time as the Bolshevik colony of Hampstead, an area of London populated by British communists and Soviet agents. Now, ARCOS had been established after the signing of the Anglo-Soviet Trade Agreement in 1921, whereby the Russian government could promote trade with Britain. It also served as the perfect smokescreen behind which Russia could conduct espionage operations in Britain. Yet it was Edith's relationship with a known Soviet agent, an ARCOS colleague, and who would later become her future husband, Andrew Rothstein, that eventually saw her name appear on a Home Office warrant issued on the 25th of March 1921. Edith's association with Rothstein cast doubt on her sister's true allegiances, with some in the Secret Service suspecting that the women worked for Russia. Lucy worked in MI6, and after attending Liverpool University, the only sister that they could pay to put through university, Helen, she went to Liverpool University, she commenced a career as a translator in government code and cipher school, working on diplomatic decrypts. And the youngest, Peggy, before she became a doctor, spent several years during the early 1920s also working at government code and cipher school. Now, the family had no idea that every aspect of their lives was put under the microscope and scrutinised by Britain's Security Service MI5 and Special Branch. For several years, letters were intercepted and their movements monitored. And by 1926, Lucy and Helen were eventually deemed not a security risk by the MI6 chief Hugh Sinclair. But the fact remains that MI6 was so quick to question the sisters' loyalty, choosing to see them as foreigners in that instant rather than as British subjects. This was because they were not born in England, they didn't have any of the connections with the ruling classes, they didn't know the right people, they didn't move in the right society circles. Had they been born and raised in England with a necessary social standing, had they attended finishing school, as many well-bred young women were required to do so, one wonders whether MI6 would have ever pointed the finger of suspicion at them. Now, during the interwar period, Helen and Lucy continued to prove themselves beyond reproach. Lucy worked abroad as again I say secretary, but we all know that means a hell of a lot more, performing MI6 duties under the cover of the Passport Control Office in Istanbul, Rome, Athens, before she joined Helen and one of her brothers, John, at Bletchley Park in 1939. So the Lund sisters were not a natural fit in British intelligence. Their Russian heritage made them women of two worlds. Yet, like countless others sworn to secrecy, they never told anyone about their work at Bletchley Park. And you can learn more about the remarkable women of Britain's secret services. There are so many in my book, which proves beyond doubt that intelligence work has always been a woman's game. Thank you very much.
Why can't we go in the top floor of Bletchley?
Okay, yes, so good question. I thought that might be asked. I have actually been allowed, I've gone up, but when I was writing the book for research purposes, they allowed me upstairs. It is completely empty now. It did used to be, they did used to rent them out to businesses who operated from there, but it is all now empty now. And I am lobbying for the MI6 story, part of it, to be told upstairs on the first floor. But unfortunately, those that have been in the mansion, you'll know there's the beautiful wooden staircase at the back of the mansion where you can see it goes up to the first floor. There's also some very windy servants' staircases, and it's incredibly difficult to get a lift in there for those that can't use the stairs. So unfortunately, that's the practical issue, which is this sort of the sticking point as to why the first floor, but fingers crossed in the future they find a way to do so, because it is rather beautiful up there.
Yeah. But, I mean, we have had a couple of Alumni Association visits, haven't we, Veronica, to Bletchley Park, and I wonder whether perhaps it's something we might want to think about revisiting, because and also, anyone in the audience who has any information about any of these people or stories that they might like to share, I think Veronica is dead keen to connect with you. So for now, I'm just going to step away and let your questions be heard. Just one final thing. I mean, the fascinating sort of interconnections and networks that we have. So I was talking to Claire over lunch, and we were chatting about wartime Lincolnshire, where I have grandparents who were involved in things in the war. And I didn't tell you that my great-grandparents came back from Russia in 1917. It was just as it happened. So interesting, something to follow up, perhaps. Anyway, I'm going to pass you over to Christine for managing a question. Is that okay, Christine?
Sure. I was just wondering if any of your 39 women, or if you know of any other women who worked in the local Oxford branch of Bletchley Park, which was Naval Intelligence Division 10 at Mansfield College during the war. There were over 300 women there at one point. So I was just wondering if you know of any of those. And then I just had one more question, which was about the index which you mentioned. Because I understand there was a copy of the central index kept at the New Bodleian Library. And I wondered if you had any information about how that was updated and how often it was updated, and if there were any women working on that you know of from St Hugh's here during the war.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
The answer to that, unfortunately, is no. What we have tried to do, actually, is to trace names through a combination of the register, which I always hope that we will see volume 2 of the register. The register has been absolutely invaluable for this type of work. Combination of that, obituaries, the Bletchley Park Oral History Project, and the work that Dr. Corley did some years ago on women working in World War II. There's actually an awful lot of material there to follow up. So what we've tried to do is look at the names in the register and see if they're on the roll of honour at Bletchley Park. And if we think they should be, contacting Bletchley Park itself for more information. But they would prefer to have information from us because they get so many inquiries. So anything you would like me to know about and follow up, I will do. But we have started off in a particular way. And I was going to mention that there is, just to join on to that, we do know that there are a number of WAFs who actually served at Bletchley Park who are also St Hugh's women. And I've concentrated on ATS and Wrens. I haven't even got round to the WAFs as well. So it may well be that there are many others who feature there. But I'm willing to follow up any lead. I'm very happy to give you my card. Follow up any lead that people could give me, and I will research it.
If I could just tag on about Mansfield College, because we are on the very edge, literally on the edge, of living history. And I had the great honour and privilege of interviewing, I think maybe the only veteran of Mansfield College alive, Elizabeth Kayser. I had the honour, she just turned 100 last year, and she's actually just turned 101 this year. I mean, this generation, they drank a particular type of water, didn't they? I mean, the ages that they lived to, it's incredible. But that's the only veteran I think I know who is still alive, because of course, you've mentioned that St Hugh, they've all, unfortunately,
Yes.
who are known. Yeah.
January 2020.
Yes, yeah. So whether there are any others out there, I'm not sure. But she was at Mansfield College very briefly, involved in code making. But it wasn't just naval intelligence that were at Mansfield College. There was also MI6 operating there as well. And I think there's a lot more to come out of that story in the future. And of course, Elizabeth Kayser's story, I won't say any more, but more of her story will be told. But she did actually leave Mansfield College and go on to do something quite amazing for the rest of the war. So watch that space. But yes, if anybody knows of any other veterans that are from any of the Oxford colleges, she was at LMH, because we are literally on the cusp.
There's also an ongoing project at St Anne's, which Matthew Chipping, our archivist, is involved in. And their records, I suppose I put this quite carefully, are not as complete or up-to-date as ours. The St Hugh's records are absolutely superb. We've been praised for how, well, they're not complete, but how complete they are compared to, for example, women at the Scottish universities who served at Bletchley Park. Their records have all been completely destroyed or dissipated. But St Anne's is working from the ground upwards with Matthew's help to compile a list of their Bletchley Park veterans. So as you see, and in relation also to what Claire says, this is ongoing research. And although these wonderful veterans are all now gone, there are many relatives, descendants, people, members of the public who want to know more. Colleges ought to know more about these people. Institutions ought to know more because they were real flesh and blood. They weren't, as we say, ciphers.
Thank you very much for that fascinating talks. I wondered if you could expand a little more on the burning. You mentioned that some of these women went to their graves and burnt their papers, suggesting possibly that the men didn't. But I wondered, in terms of the recipients of the cables or the communications, is there a flip side of that record that can still be accessed?
You didn't hear? No?
Oh,
That's fine. If you can just hold it right up to you.
Sorry, thank you very much for that fascinating talk. I was wondering, you mentioned that people had gone to many of the women went to their graves and burnt their papers. My first question was, were the recipients of that communication, are there still records to be accessed from the sort of flip side of those communications? And the other was, I don't know whether you were suggesting, but I sort of thought that the men possibly didn't do the same with their records, and I don't know whether that was true or not.
Okay, yeah. So two sort of questions there. So the first one in relation to the MI6 CODIS and the MI6 agents that were operating in the field, those communications, they're locked away in MI6 headquarters in a big safe. I like to imagine an Indiana Jones type warehouse, when you see at the end of the films where, the Last Crusade, where everything, all the treasures disappear, never to be seen again, the equivalent of that in MI6, and they're not available. You can, within some of the SOE records, you can find mentions of MI6 agents, but they're not named, obviously for security purposes. So it's incredibly difficult to find out anything about the MI6 agents that were the equivalent of what SOE was doing behind enemy lines. So until they open their archives and allow us a bit of a chink of light in there, which I dream of this happening, but I'm not sure it's going to, we won't be able to answer that unless they're, again, family collections, things that survive that people find attics or under the bed when people unfortunately pass away. That again might be a way in. But like Veronica said, it's intelligence history, it's always evolving because we're never ever going to have a complete picture. It's just trying to get as many pieces on the board as possible. And sometimes pieces can change what you originally thought. It's the wonderful thing of history, isn't it? I can remember my lecturers at university, pushing the boundaries of knowledge. That wonderful quote. The other part, in terms of the men keeping records, I'm always sort of asked a similar type question, as in, why did so many men write memoirs after the First World War and Second compared to women? And I think the main reason for the men is because, of course, they didn't see active service on the fighting front. So perhaps they wanted to share with the world that they actually did something important, just as important. That's my feel. I think the women are far better at keeping secrets. And of course, for the most part, the women, they didn't really see what they were doing as being hugely important. And they were much better at compartmentalising that section of their lives. And then after the war had finished, everyone was looking forward, not backwards. And of course, there were a number of women, you mentioned a number, who stayed and worked on at places like GCHQ, of the St Hugh's women that you mentioned. That's the case for across the board. There are a number of women that stay on and have careers. And of course, they by doing that decision, they have to make the ultimate sacrifice of not marrying. Because in the case of MI6, the marriage bar wasn't lifted until 1973. So it's incredibly late. MI5 was a lot earlier. It was the end of the 40s, after the end of the Second World War, but incredibly late. So, they found ways around it, ladies and gentlemen. But again, it was not deemed the expectation within society that you would have a partner. It was, you would have a husband. So you couldn't obviously have children if you weren't married. So huge sacrifice with that. But yes, in terms of the men, I think perhaps that might be part of the reason.
I think there was also an element of competition between the men in relation to memoirs. The one who broke the rules first was Gordon Welshman, who'd already gone off to work in the US in security and intelligence. And if you read quite a few stories about the internal life at Bletchley Park, there were some fantastic feuds between the men who headed up the various huts and sections, even coming to swearing and blows and so on. And I think Gordon Welshman was extremely irritated about people like, if you say, Alan Turing, Dilly Knox, who actually died during the war. But there was the idea of being able to show that you were so important in this outfit, as indeed they were. I mean, nobody's actually saying they weren't important, but Gordon Welshman shouldn't have written a memoir, but of course the moment he did, everybody else, every other man thinks, hey, hang on a minute, they need to know my recollections as well. And then, of course, you've got official histories like by Harry Hinsley. You've got later reminiscences by the historian Asa Briggs, who I've mentioned. There is a wonderful book called 100 People You Didn't Know Who Worked at Bletchley Park by Sinclair Mackay, who did many history books for Bletchley Park. And you open it and you think, whoa, I didn't know that. But also there was Alan Cairncross, who of course is, as we know, was a spy. Alan Cairncross worked there. All sorts of people, and all sorts of people therefore started to contribute their reminiscences, but the dam actually broke with Gordon Welshman, who did what he shouldn't. And I think it was during the time of Mrs Thatcher's government, and there was absolute fury at governmental level that he'd actually broken the rules. But the women kept quiet, and it was only until you start hearing from people like Mavis Lever, who Dilly Knox called the Black Swan. Only then did the women actually start to say, well, actually, I did this. It's only a small part of it. And if you look, for example, at June Rigby's memoir for the Oral History Project, she started off by saying, thinking, I didn't do anything really important. It was traffic analysis. And I think it was June, who visited Bletchley Park and was introduced to the custodian at the time. And she said, oh, I only did. And he said, come on in, you did far more than that. Do you know what the context of what you were actually doing? And she's written a wonderful memoir on that subject. I'll just touch on the idea of the women who didn't marry, because I mentioned that the women who did marry, the 14 St Hugh's women in Bletchley Park, who did marry, they actually all married in like 1946, 47, 48, and gave up work because if you think of what Claire is saying about the ban on being married in MI6 and so on, you couldn't actually be, for example, a teacher and married at that time. You had to, I remember my mother saying she would have loved to have been, she was born in the same year as Alice Bishop, 1913. Alice Bishop, the modern linguist. My mother would have loved to have taught modern languages, but you couldn't do that if you were married. So although I'm very sad about the 14 very talented women who decided to stop work on marriage, it was very understandable in the social context of the time. And even though, as I say, 22% of our women actually met and married their husbands at Bletchley Park, and we're always told that nobody could talk about anything to anybody. Well, yeah, that would have been slightly awkward in the context in which we're talking about. But generally speaking, women, as Claire said, this is the work you did. You might not understand it 100%. You knew it was incredibly important because you'd signed the Official Secrets Act. You can't talk about it. You don't talk about it. And you move on, and if you can, you have a career. You could work at GCHQ as unmarried. Nancy Littlewood, for example, remained unmarried and worked at GCHQ. I think Joyce Lloyds did as well. But others went into other walks of life. But if you look at people who had really distinguished careers, I would say there were probably only about 3, which bear in mind the talents, the intellectual ability of these women. It worries me a bit, but then it was that time.
Any more questions?
Thank you for the talks. I'm sure St Hugh's played the most important part, but were any of the other women's colleges much... Did any of the other women's colleges send people to Bletchley Park, or did they end up there? And is anyone doing research on those?
In terms of St Anne's, yes, that I do know about. And I certainly believe that all women's colleges are looking at it, and they may well be more advanced than us. As I mentioned, the Scottish universities, which sent a considerable proportion of women graduates to Bletchley Park, their records are in complete disarray, so I don't know what they are doing. But certainly when Claire and I were speaking at Newnham in the other place last year, I think what we were hearing is that Cambridge records and our records were actually the best on women graduates that you were going to get. I'm pretty sure that LMH has got a very advanced project. I mean, let's try and find out, but I think it's such an important subject to look at these cohorts of women, and they really are a cohort. And it's important because although they're all deceased, their families are still here. Their families are around us, and therefore we have to keep on going, not for the sake of each individual college, although it's helpful and useful, but these are real stories here of people who are basically mothers, grandmothers, great-grandmothers, generation. Keep on going, find out more.
It was mentioned that female recruits were often recruited from so-called good families, but were they ever given any sort of formal aptitude test?
Yeah. Well, so I know for MI6 that it really was the social connections. You hear often about the tap on the shoulder at a cocktail party, or a friend from school, whatever, has said, I've joined, I think you'd be a great fit. And then it leads to an interview. I'm not sure about tests in the way of skill testing. I think it was really kind of just an interview, a chat, shall we say. Languages being one of the key things that was sought in particular. But there was a whole range of recruitment means that these women were recruited by. And I mentioned the famous Miss Maud Moore of the Foreign Office. And she really is the one woman, the spotter, who would have been looking out, having those connections here with St Hugh's, LMH, Newnham, etc., and funneling, making sure they're getting the right people coming through into to Bletchley Park. She gets cited in the London Gazette at the end of the war. So that gives you an idea of how crucial and important her work was seen. But yes, I don't think there was no sitting down and doing the crossword like in the Imitation Game, which of course was done, but I'll pass over to you now for...
I suppose it's fair to say that when we're looking at women graduates, not only from this college, it's fair to say that looking at the women graduates from this college, other colleges, the universities, they were recruited, generally speaking, by contacts through the principal, senior tutors. And again, there was an element of who do you know, because the principals of the colleges were related or friendly with or knew people within the intelligence services, people within government, people in politics. And the network was very similar. Who do you know who would be helpful and useful in this situation? So certainly the recruitment evidence at St Hugh's is from April 1942, when Miss Guire was approached behind the scenes by people that she knew, including, I think, her own brother, or people that she had grown up with who were in senior positions in government. And so she was looking through the undergraduates of the day, and she would write references for them, she would put names forward. And that's indeed what Mary Blake was actually saying, that her name had been put forward for the new ATS Intelligence Corps. So what you're there looking at, you're not aptitude tests per se, but you were looking at women who had a certain understood level of educational and intellectual attainment because they'd got into an Oxford college. And I also mentioned, I think, that when I was looking through all the student files, all the non-modern languages undergraduates had got higher certificate French, including with distinctions. And so there's a level of demonstrable educational attainment there. Otherwise, actually, they wouldn't have got into St Hugh's. But I have heard there were certain aptitude tests, including being asked if you enjoyed doing crosswords, or were you good at doing crosswords. And I think it was probably Mavis Lever who said, well, no, actually, I don't. But there was some quite scary interviewing, sometimes conducted in some outpost in Scotland, where you had this very rigorous interviewing, and it would be about your character and so on. But I don't think that anybody, whether they came from a debutante background or an undergraduate background, would have gone through a sloppy interview. Absolutely not. I think it was actually rigorous. But I do accept the point that for those who were not graduates, but were probably, dare I say it, upper class people, upper class women with language skills, there was a lot of who do we know in that situation. But I suppose apart from Anne McDougall, Mrs. Crossman, I'd probably keep our graduates away on one side and say, yes, they did demonstrate rigorous selection because of their educational and intellectual attainments.
Thank you. Is that audible? Yeah. Thank you very much, first of all. I think writing women's history always poses, definite challenges. But given, the context in which you work, the challenges are, peculiar and particular. My question is actually to Dr. Hubbard-Hall, because there seems to me, some need for clarification. You were making the point that when it comes to the legacies, the aftermath of, years of involvement in war work and, the confrontation with, often very, difficult and tragic incidents, that women were particularly able to cope, to compartmentalize, as you put it, and deal with it. But it seems to me to contradict the statement you were making earlier in relation to MI6 women and the nightmares they were having that were haunting them. So the two aspects to that, the question is, where does your particular evidence for these nightmares come from, based on what type of data or what kind of material, on the one hand. On the other hand, is it not also necessary to understand how these women were particularly affected in many ways by the work? Is it, if one might be perhaps a little bit too light on the kind of impact that war work, the work that they did, had on the women, as, compared to men? Also kind of underestimating the impact, on these particular women.
Okay, right. Where to start first with that? Yes, no, thank you very much. So where I got the evidence of, there is an argument now, you can't sort of historically diagnose what these women were suffering with and living with. You could hypothesize and say it's a form of post-traumatic stress disorder in the modern term, but the evidence came from oral history interviews and memoirs in terms of them struggling with constant dreams, nightmares is probably the better word to use, of reliving, I guess, those moments sat decoding a particular message and the realization that the individual that they've been communicating with for, shall we say, maybe weeks or months, because unfortunately the life of an agent in the field was incredibly short. knowing that that person they had been communicating with had gone, and hearing the news coming through from other agents of what had happened to them, I think obviously haunted them in particular. I mean, it's very similar to SOE agents, isn't it? Men and women, and you know, their oral history interviews touch on it, not in a great detail, because of course they're from the generation where you dealt with it. There wasn't anything in terms of the modern day support that you can get now for living with these challenges. So they were very much of that generation where you were told to find a way to cope with it, to deal with it yourself. I have found evidence of some of the women in particular, shall we say, sections or groups within these secret services, that after the war they did form informal kind of support groups, I guess, which was a way of keeping in touch, but also of trying to find work as well through each other's connections. So whether that helped, that they could speak together about that, I'm not sure. But there's only inferences. Nobody actually would reveal in full detail what they were thinking, the struggles that they were living with. It's just sort of a sentence where you know from that key sentence that this was a problem for them, perhaps for many years, perhaps for the rest of their life. If we think it's living with trauma, isn't it, essentially? Well, even for the men, I mean, the men, again, same category. I'm not sure it's gender specific, it's probably person specific, perhaps. And individuals deal with things very differently. And men from that generation are taught not to show their emotions. I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure how to answer that question in a further than what I've said.
If I could just comment, I think there is possibly a difference to be made here between the 100 women who served in Hut 10, who were the ones that we heard very graphically from Claire, were in the constant hourly, daily, weekly contact with our agents overseas. And those were the ones who disappeared or got into deep, deep trouble with the Gestapo. And that seemed to me, having read Claire's book, is where some of the evidence for nightmares would actually come in, because they're reliving that after the war. The people that they got so used to dealing with in a very complex situation had suddenly disappeared. And there is a difference in the sense that although St Hugh's may have had at least one woman working that time in Hut 10, that's under research. Our women actually were working in any number of categories within Bletchley Park in which they saw a part of the story. There was another section apart from Hut 10, part of the naval section, that also saw absolutely everything going on because they were disseminating naval intelligence, and so they also had quite a wide view. Many women who worked at Bletchley Park didn't have that view, but I would go back to what Nancy Sandars and June Rigby actually recorded. Nancy Sandars was a radio operator at the Y listening station Abbotscliff near Dover for D-Day. There's a lot of information about Nancy and a website online, and she's a fascinating person, so I'd urge everybody to take a look. And it was an extremely intensive, trying and upsetting experience. June Rigby also mentioned in her Bletchley Park Oral History Project testimony about the effect on her of working through Sixter traffic analysis for the Battle of the Bulge. So we're talking about women who experience particular moments of considerable stress and crisis. They have not, in my understanding, said, well, it had an effect on me in later life. It might have done, but they haven't talked about it. But they are also women who, dare I say it, got on with their lives, and they may have pushed aside any unpleasant thoughts. for example, Nancy, I mentioned, was a very eminent archaeologist, worked all over the world, was a colleague of Dame Kathleen Kenyon, who is principal here. Superb linguist, had an amazing archaeological career, never married. And she had what seems to be rather a great career. June Rigby became a lecturer who lectured at universities all over, anywhere from Gambia to South Africa, and also within this country as well. So there are women who went on to have careers concentrated on other things, and they felt able to mention particular experiences, but not actually to say whether they suffered any mental health or well-being problem thereafter. And perhaps it was, again, as Claire said, part of the ethos at the time, and I remember it very well from my parents, that you do not talk about your feelings. And particularly in this context, you're meant to keep things secret. You don't talk about your feelings. You don't make yourself look... It's not a look at me situation, which it is if you talk about your feelings. This is in my, what my parents would have said. So you keep quiet unless, of course, you have a breakdown, which people had for all sorts of reasons, not necessarily war-related. And then you had to have medical attention. But otherwise, you kept quiet.
Could I just add something? Because I actually knew Nancy quite well, because she was my husband's aunt. And she never made a big deal about at Dover. She said to me, well, we had to put buckets everywhere because it leaked. She made a joke about it. And the other thing she said was, when the Germans went back, all they did was duck. She just, and in later life, she never in any way appeared disturbed and upset by what her experiences had been. As you say, she went on to be a very eminent archaeologist. She was also a friend of Peter Levy. She wrote poetry. She was quite an outstanding human being.
Yes.
I was immensely fond of her, and definitely not somebody who was suffering from post-traumatic stress. Just as an example.
I mean, the only thing I think of sources, coming back to your original question, where I've had time to chew it over very quickly, is SOE, really. I think that's the only organisation where you'd be able to drill down in terms of what you're asking there. And it wouldn't be from the actual agent's voice, it would be from their families. So at the very end of the war, before SOE was disbanded, there's a huge amount of correspondence within each of the SOE agents' files who didn't make it back. Vera Atkins with the F section women, all that family correspondence over the months, over the years, is in those files. So that would be a way of measuring the impact, perhaps, on the family, but it's very, very difficult to try and get that agent's voice. But thank you very much for that interesting question. Thank you.
I'd like to talk about shooting parties and croquet mallets. Do you not think the title of that photo is one big spoof? There we are, gentlemen collecting outside a country house. No, where are the grouse? Where are the, But in another sense, they are shooting, aren't they? Metaphorically, through their work. So it's both a spoof and a metaphor. And I should think the whole thing is just one big joke. Well said.
That's terrific. That is absolutely terrific. And I'm afraid I sort of took it as of its time that what would gentlemen be doing at a large country mansion, albeit not in tweeds with not in those sort of tweeds with ladies in attendance? Oh, it could be a shooting party. And of course, as we know, Captain Ridley did exist, and he was at Bletchley Park until about 1942, I think. So I sort of took it at face value. But what I think is absolutely extraordinary, and I'm really glad that Claire showed the photo. The photo is attached to a Christmas card in the form of a letter.
Shall I? Yeah. Yes. So this, I mean, it always gets trotted out in the newspapers. So it's not a traditional Christmas card. Evelyn Sinclair, who is the sister of the MI6 chief Hugh Sinclair, who bought Bletchley Park, she also worked for MI6 and Government Code and Cipher School. She did a bit of everything, but she didn't get paid because she already had a lot of money, so it was all free labour. But she sent out this famous Christmas card to people in the know, and it literally was, she always used this particular blue handwriting paper with her address, Carlisle, on the top. And it was just folded over with the photograph, copies of the photograph stuck onto it. And she sent it off to various key people who obviously had been in that photograph as an in the know kind of nod. And that photograph is held at Bletchley Park. But when I was doing my research, especially the MI6 ladies that were quite high up, I found lots of these Christmas cards. So that isn't the only one that gets trotted out in the newspapers and on the news. There are many, many more, all held by people in the know.
And if you look back, if you think about it, wow, fancy sending this out. As you say, we've still got copies, but wasn't it slightly risky to do that in the first place? Except she did send it, to be fair, to people in the know. But when I came across it, I thought,
I'm going to have to bring this most fascinating discussion to a close because I know people have some transport. Thank you. It's been fabulously interesting, and I think Veronica is going to be thrilled that there are obviously people here that are going to help us develop the story further. Really fascinating. I think you could probably also guess that once upon a time Veronica read history at St Hugh's as well.
Yes.
That's pretty obvious. We have a couple of little gifts on behalf of the association and the college. I'm going to be like roving Mike and roving gift person. So I'm going to do this one, which is to you, Claire. So just a little bit of token of thanks for your contribution today. It's been absolutely fascinating. And I think we also have some flowers for Veronica. So there you go. Really, really appreciated. Thank you. So just to say, I hope you've appreciated too, like being able to network with each other. I mean, it is just fascinating, the connections that we all have, and I hope this is the start of more interest in following up these women and their great contributions. I just want to thank quickly the college because the development office have obviously been responsible for getting the event so well organised. And perhaps before you leave, you might want to take a look at the table over there, which lists some more events that are happening later in the year, and also some information too about your book. I think that's it for me, really. Just a huge thanks. I don't know whether you'd like to.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, you want?
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Sam. I just thought I wanted to add my enormous thanks for a fantastic lecture today, and absolutely fascinated to hear about the role of the principal in all of that. So thank you. I'd like to know more about that. As Sam said, it's a big thank you to Claire and to Veronica. Thank you to the Development Office. Big thank you to the Alumni Association and the committee for all that you do for the college. But also just a big thank you to all of you for coming today, for being part of this fantastic St Hugh's community. Thank you for all of your support. I hope you enjoy your time here. If you do have time, please do have a wander around the gardens. They're just starting to look fantastic. But thank you all for coming, and we really look forward to welcoming you back to college soon. Thank you.